Hello, everybody. I'm Myron Medcalf with the King Book Club, here with the incredible author David Mura, who is the author of The Stories Whiteness Tells Itself, Racial Myths and American Narratives. And this is a part of our series where, we're trying to keep our book club members and just other readers informed about things that we're reading to continue to learn and grow as we all try to journey toward a better Twin Cities, Minnesota, and really America. And this book really stood out. David, I've obviously worked with you with past panels with the King Book Club because I think the premise is fascinating and also necessary. You've written a number of books. Why this book? And also, why did you want to write this book now?
Well, I started writing probably about 2013, 14 on Black Lives Matter, and I did a few essays. Then Philando Castile was murdered on Larpenteur Road by the officer Geronimo Yanez. And like many people in the Twin Cities, that murder deeply affected me and felt very close. I knew people who knew him. I've driven down that road many times. I've even got speeding tickets there.
Mm.
And I realized as I began to narrate and examine what had happened to Philando Castile that I couldn't understand it without understanding the roots of American racism and American racial categories. And for instance, the idea which was promulgated during the 19th century after the Emancipation Proclamation, that Black people were inherently criminal, and how this idea infected American culture. Because obviously, when Black people were slaves, they couldn't be criminals because they weren't citizens, they weren't property. And to understand how all this happened, right? And then I realized that I had to go back to the beginnings of America when the categories of Blackness and whiteness were created by white people. And what I realized was that America has always been ruled by what I call whiteness, which is an ideology, a set of rules, beliefs, ideas, and practices which govern how white people think and behave in the realm of race and how they look at other people of color. And I realized how little we understand about those categories, why they were instituted, and how deeply they affect the way our society is run.
I think that's such an important tie there because I think a lot of people over the course of these last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, especially here, have been asking a lot of the same questions. What are the seeds to this? And I think you do such a good job of tying Philando and what's happened to so many like him, George Floyd, obviously others, and the dehumanization. You talk about Thomas Jefferson and his perspective on slavery and the Black people and how that has resonated even today. But I think the most fascinating part of your book for me is the conversation around Lincoln, because Abraham Lincoln is often the first person mentioned when it comes to American history as someone who should be admired, praised, revered, even for freeing the slaves. And it is this idea that he represents American goodwill among white people, among white leadership. And your book aims to challenge that idea. Why was it important for you to talk about Abraham Lincoln, and what role does he play in the conversation about whiteness and the myths attached to that?
I think there are two things. One is that we are supposedly not allowed to talk about the fact that Lincoln was a racist.
Mm.
He clearly believed that white people were superior to Black people. When a group of Black ministers came to the White House, he told them, "You will never become part of America." He told them, "The least white man is better than the best Black man." Now, in looking at the way people talk about this, there are people who say, well, that was the times. You have to judge Lincoln according to the racial climate of his times. I understand that. Compared to Jefferson Davis, Lincoln was a great man, and certainly his signing the Emancipation Proclamation was a great step forward in racial progress for America. But when we say the racial climate of Lincoln's time, who are we talking about? Because those Black ministers who came to the White House believed they could be part of America, believed they were equal, did not believe in racial superiority, and they were part of Lincoln's time. So when people say, let's think about the racial climate of time, they're only thinking about white people. They're not thinking about the fact that at every single point in our racial history, the majority of Black people were right about racial issues and the majority of white people were wrong. So you're saying, let's judge history, but you're excising those Black ministers from the racial climate of their times in the present. You're not seeing them as part of America. And that is a racist move, which is occurring in the present. Just like when you say, Thomas Jefferson, it was so long ago. Yes, he owned slaves, but what do we care, right? It's so long ago. Well, we know that there are incredible health disparities in the American healthcare system. Infant mortality, maternal mortality, how much money goes into certain research for certain diseases. We know that Black people receive half as much pain medication for the same conditions as white people, and they receive it less often than white people for the same conditions. Now, in 2016, they did a study of 222 white medical students, and half of those students, white medical students, believed some form of the idea that Black people feel less physical pain than white people. Now, Jefferson was a leading ideologist of slavery during his time. He was an eloquent, great writer, and he wrote about how white people were superior intelligently, morally, spiritually to Black people. And he said that Black people were more suited to slavery because they felt less physical pain. Mm. So this idea that he's writing about in like 1790, 1810 is there in half of these white medical students in 2016. So you can't tell me that the past is in the past. It's there in the minds of these white medical students. Now, I don't believe that, the majority of these medical students who believe this are racist. They probably don't even understand that this idea is racist. Yeah. But they're infected by the ideas that Jefferson introduced into American culture and society. So the past isn't that far past. It's still present and with us. It still shapes the way we think about the world, the way we interact with each other.
As you talk about pain tolerance, my mind immediately goes to the Rodney King video.
Yes.
And the conversation, when you hear the officers talk about Rodney King and how they claimed that they hit him, tased, beat him, and it didn't do anything. He was sort of like a monster, and how that translates to the Philandos, the George Floyds, and this idea of what the Black body can take, because the Black body has been dehumanized and eliminated from American history. So I think there's a tie there.
Yes, and that's exactly what Officer Darren Wilson said about why he killed Michael Brown in Ferguson. Right, yeah. Because he felt like he was wrestling with a Hulk, with somebody who was superhuman. Yeah. Right? These ideas, but the thing about Philando Castile also that I noticed is that if you look at the video, Diamond Phillips, Philando Castile's girlfriend, yeah, she is trying desperately to remain calm. Like Officer Yanez is just freaking out. She knows that any action that she makes, which makes him freak out more, will not only endanger her life, but the life of her 4-year-old. And she is also aware that her word will not be trusted, which is why she's videotaping, right? And my friend Alex Payton and I did a performance piece back in 1992, 93 about the Rodney King video. And that was the first time that, one of the first times that technology caught up with racism. And the point I want to make is that Black people have been talking about police brutality, about police murders, about police racism since they were subject to the rule of police, and white people haven't believed them. The only reason why white people believe them is because they saw video proof. And what this illustrates is a rule which underlies so much of our discourse on race, which is that white knowledge is always valid, objective, true, and official. White knowledge is always valid, objective, true, and official. Black knowledge is always invalid, subjective, false or suspicious, and unofficial, unless white people decree it. Now, when Diamond Phillips is trying to become and recording this, she understands this rule. She understands that her knowledge, her narrative will not be believed, right? And we see evidence. And what is it in the emergency room when the white doctor doesn't believe that the Black patient feels pain? It's my knowledge of your body is superior to your knowledge of your own body, right? Or when Ron DeSantis says the AP African American history course lacks educational value. Now, this is an AP history course created by African American scholars and writers. Governor Ron DeSantis is not an African American scholar. He doesn't have a PhD in history, but he believes it's his right to say it lacks educational value because his knowledge is white knowledge. It is valid, objective, true, and official. The knowledge of these Black scholars with PhDs is still invalid, subjective, false, and unofficial. Yeah. And what we don't realize is the connection of this to slavery. Because when the Africans came to America, they were forbidden to teach their culture. They were forbidden to teach their language. They were forbidden to teach their history. What is DeSantis doing? He's saying, African Americans, you cannot teach your history. You cannot teach your culture. Only I can deem what you can teach. Yeah. And if that's not white supremacy, what is?
Well, and I think a part of your book, you mentioned something that I think is relevant. You talk about the relationship between the master and the slave, and how what matters in terms of power structure really is how the master sees himself and how he sees a slave. Whereas the slave has to understand how the master views him or her, but also has to understand how the master sees himself. But then the ticket to freedom is defying that idea. So there's this duality. And I think about that because this book club is named after my great-great-great-grandmother, Mary Ann Key, who was enslaved in Georgia and Alabama. And the family she worked for after the slaves were freed, because like so many slaves, there was no freedom. There was nowhere to go. She continued to work for that same family almost to her death. But she had a son, and the son had ended up working at another plantation. And one of the white family members wrote a letter about an interaction with the son. And the son ran home and he said, the Key family was their name, Mary Ann Key. The Key family is good white folks. And if anyone had ever tried to harm them, they'd have to go through me. And I've thought so much about that, that my great uncle, I guess he would be, had in that moment had his quote unquote freedom, but saw himself as a protector of the white family that had enslaved him and his mother. And just the ideology of that is so fascinating. But you talk about this in your book and how many ways I think when you're an African American, it's still relevant today. The way you were taught to think about whiteness and the journey toward understanding how you have to progress in your life and thrive in your life against what that often stands for, if that makes sense.
Yes. No, and so much of this depends on the way we tell the past, the narratives we create of the past. That is why DeSantis is so fearful of this African American history course. That is why Moms for Liberty wants to ban books about Ruby Bridges. Now, Ruby Bridges was a 6-year-old Black girl who desegregated New Orleans school in 1960. And she had to pass through a crowd of jeering, shouting, angry white people with signs, some of them spitting.
Yeah.
Moms for Liberty says, oh, this is going to damage our white children. This is going to make them feel bad about themselves. And they're really not telling the truth about that. Because when children read this book, they identify with Ruby Bridges.
Yeah.
They identify with her courage. They identify with her fight for social justice. And they disidentify with the jeering white racists. And that is what Moms for Liberty is afraid of, that their white children will identify with Ruby Bridges, will identify with the fight for civil rights, will identify with her courage. And they will not think, oh, Ruby Bridges is Black, I can't identify with her. I can't feel her humanity. And the other reason why Moms for Liberty doesn't care about Black people is if they cared about the effect of violent narratives upon children, they would be working to make sure that the fact that every African American parent must tell their child narratives of police brutality and police murder doesn't occur again. They would be concerned that Black parents have to tell their kids these narratives of police brutality and police murder in order to help them to survive any police encounter. But these Moms for Liberty, they don't care about the fragility of Black children. Right. So we're in a time when this telling of history, because we're many portions of the population, white population, are going backwards in history, where suddenly things that we thought we had settled on are no longer settled on. DeSantis wants to say, oh, things like, say, the Rosewood Massacre in Florida. It was violence by both Black people and white people. The Tulsa Massacre. It was violence both by Black people and white people, which is just insane.
Yeah.
But it's like, if you can begin to control the way we tell history and leave out the perspective and narratives of people of color, you've already begun, reestablishing white supremacy at a different level in our society. Yeah. And that's where many of these people are headed.
I think one thing that this book, Stories Whiteness, tells itself, David Mura, I hope everyone goes and reads it. One thing that I think is so fascinating is the end of the book, because I feel like we're reaching this point where there's fatigue and apathy, and I never know what to tell people about that. You're apathetic about the fight for justice. I'll never stop. This is my life, and my children's lives are at stake. But that is an element in this, and a sense of, well, haven't I done enough? Haven't I learned enough? And your book at the end does something that I think is important. It walks people through sort of what are those steps. And I've experienced that in different things that I've had to learn more about, whether it's feminism and misogyny, or the LGBTQIA plus community, even other BIPOC communities that I may understand on a surface level, but not the full range of the journey. I was in Tucson, Arizona, on business, driving up Mount Tucson, about a 7,000 foot mountain, actually mountain limit, I'm sorry, about 7,000 feet you're driving up. And I stop on the side of the road, and there was a sign that says, "This highway was built by Japanese Americans who were in internment camps." Now, obviously, I know that's something you understand and a part of your family history. But I must say, as someone who thought I knew a lot about what the Japanese internment camp experience entailed, that was knowledge for me. That was something that I didn't understand. And it made me want to learn and understand more. And I'm saying all that to say, is if people who are experiencing these things understand that our quench for learning and understanding can't cease, then anybody else who's not affected by those things has to also maintain that pursuit if they're serious about change. And I think your book at the end, it's very important when you say, okay, what can I do? And you offer almost steps, instructions, things to read, things to do for, I think, the white people who will say, how do I change? How do I grow? Why did you think that was such an important part? And why did you want to end your book like that?
Well, first I want to just talk about the point you made up about Japanese Americans, and then I'll address that. Because when people say, well, it doesn't affect my life. I recently co-produced and wrote and narrated a documentary called Armed with Language. It's a Twin Cities public television documentary on the Japanese American soldiers who studied Japanese at the military intelligence school that was located first in Savage and then at Fort Snelling. Now, at the beginning of World War II, the American military forces went, we have white people who speak Italian, can translate messages and interrogate prisoners. We have white people who speak German. We don't have any white people who speak Japanese. And they realized they needed Japanese speakers and translators. So they had to go into the camps to recruit Japanese Americans to serve in the military, even while they and their families were in prison. Now, these men and about 100 women went out into the Pacific and served as battlefield guides, as interrogators of prisoners, as translators of captured documents and intelligence. And MacArthur's chief of intelligence, General Willoughby, in the Pacific, said that these Japanese American military intelligence service linguists shortened the war in the Pacific by 2 years and saved 1 million American lives, which means there are racist, anti-immigrant white people who are walking around today because of the efforts of these Japanese Americans. And so what it actually says is diversity is our strength. It is what makes our society so creative, so dynamic, so interesting, and a beacon to the rest of the world. And rather than let's go back to the past where white supremacy rules, let's go to the future where everybody's abilities and strengths can be honored and employed to make this country greater. So now to the end of the book, one thing I always say before I speak is I'm not here to shame and guilt people. I don't believe you change people through shame and guilt. I believe you change through love and knowledge. And what I say is, none of us knows enough about race. We all have pockets of ignorance. We all have things we don't know. And so we continuously, as you said earlier, we continuously have to begin to study. But if you live a life where you're only living with your group, you have a choice to make your life more diverse by changing the way you live. And if you only have white friends, or in the case, if you only have Asian American friends, you're Asian American, it's like, what can you do to enlarge and diversify the people that you know and interact with, right? And then you have to learn more about, and so many white people, they go, well, I'm a good person. And I go, I don't know you. I'm not here to judge you whether you're a good or bad person. All I want you to do is look at how racism is so systemic in American society and really see that. And then decide, what am I going to do about that? Right? And so you not only have to know more, you not only have to change your social life. The third part is you begin to speak up. And you speak up in your family, you speak up at your place of work, you speak up in your community, and you make your views known that this racism has to stop. And for many white people, you know you're making change because you will start to make other white people angry. Because you will be breaking the rules of whiteness, which is we don't care really about this, or we don't want to have to care. And you're saying, no, what happens to any American is of importance to me. Injustice to any American is important to me. Equality for all Americans is important to me. And if you do all this, your life will change. I liken the denial of racism to Helen Kubler-Ross's the 5 stages of grief in her book on death and dying. And the 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, grief, and acceptance. So denial is there's no racism. In fact, white people are more discriminated against than people. Then it's anger. It's like, why are you bringing this up? We had a perfectly fine school till you started bringing up these issues. We had a perfectly fine church till you started bringing up these issues. We had a perfectly fine business till you started saying there were microaggressions and racism in the workplace. Then it's bargaining. Then it's, well, there is racism, but it's just a few bad apples, right? And you don't get these huge statistical disparities in the healthcare system, in the education system, in the economy. You know, the fact that Black unemployment has historically always been twice white employment. That doesn't happen by a few bad apples. And as Chris Rock said, would you want to fly on an airline that had a few bad apples as pilots? Right? So you stop bargaining. And then there's grief. And sometimes the grief is like, I'm so ashamed to be a white person, right? Right. And it's like, okay, but that doesn't do anything, you know, or like, how do you stand it? It's like, well, we've been dealing with this for years. It's like the grief, I understand the grief, but get over it, and then acceptance. And once you accept the fact of systemic racism in society, you stop spending so much energy trying to deny what is in front of your eyes. Deny what has actually happened in our history. And the energy that's spent in denial can be spent much more productively in learning and connecting with people differently than yourself and fighting for justice. And that seems to me a much better use of your energy and time. But you have to get through these stages of denial in order to get there.
I think it's fascinating you say that. I often ask some of my white friends, even with sort of a multicultural social circle, I often ask, okay, in your social gatherings, do they come to you or do you go to them? I remember one of my friends telling me, well, people usually come to me. And I said, well, you realize that's a part of your comfort. Like that in and of itself, making the decision that my interactions with people from a different community has to happen on my terms says a lot about how we see ourselves and how oftentimes marginalized communities are asked to make exceptions, to cross the street, to be the one that has to adapt and adjust to thrive, to exist, to live in a world that was not created for us to succeed. David, this is an incredible book. You should be proud of this. The stories whiteness tells itself, racial myths and our American narratives. I hope everyone goes out and picks it up. And I'm looking forward to talking to you more in the future.